Hey, Alex Williams here, founder of the new Stack in San Francisco today at the Heavy Bit offices for our, I think this might even be our 13th or 14th show. I'm not really sure, but we've been doing the show for several weeks, but today we're have some new guests who haven't been on the show before, so wanted to introduce who we have here with us. But first, the focus for today really is VMworld, and in particular, I want to talk about Project Fargo and the news around Google Kubernetes and Docker and everything else related to that VMware announced this week. But first, I'd like to introduce Alex Polvey, and Alex is with CoreOS and is actually quite familiar with Kubernetes. And Alex, can you introduce yourself? And Alex just kind of launched something that I think is pretty cool, and I thought we could spend a few minutes talking about it.
Yeah. So thanks, Alex. From one Alex to another, I appreciate the opportunity. My name is Alex Polvey. I'm the CEO of CoreOS, and we've been working a lot, in the container space. CoreOS is a Linux OS meant specifically for running containers. And today we released something, and Alex invited me to tag along here, and so I just want to talk about it briefly. The new project is called Rudder, and Rudder is an overlay network built specifically for containers. It was originally designed because of some constraints within Google Kubernetes around how every container needs to be actually on the fabric directly, kind of like how every virtual machine will have an IP address. Every container has an IP address, and this avoids all the complexity that comes in when you start doing this kind of port mapped based networking configuration, which Docker does natively. So Kubernetes says we need to put every single container on the network like it's a server. And this adds some complexity when you're in environments that can't handle that, like AWS. So that means you couldn't ever run Kubernetes on AWS, given how the networking stack works. So Rudder solves that problem. It creates an overlay network on top of the other overlay networks. It's written in Go, so it's super lightweight, and then it's backed by etcd, which means it's all distributed and fault tolerant by default. So we think it solves a pretty core problem around networking and how you do networking in this new container world. We're excited to put it out there and get people's feedback.
Okay, so this is essentially kind of something like it's a control plane that runs on top of AWS.
Yeah, it's a set of it's a program that you can run on anywhere that you can run Linux, and it will bring up an overlay network. Similar to software-defined networking is another way to put this. But because it's written in Go, it's backed by etcd. It's a very lightweight set of components that allow you to do this overlay network on top of. Again, it works on AWS. It works on bare metal. It works on Google. Wherever you can run a Go program and use etcd, you can use this overlay network.
So what are the kind of the uses for this, and why is it necessary?
Right. So what it means is every application that you run inside of a container can now be addressable on the network. So again, just any application typically needs to talk to some other application in the environment, and now they have their own actual routable IP addresses. It feels very similar to like if you were to launch a set of servers. Each of them would have an IP address on the network that allows them to talk to each other. Pretty straightforward. But for containers, you can't do that right now. With Docker, you do port mapping. So there's like an external port that maps to an internal port, and that's one approach for it. It's very convenient for certain reasons. But it also adds a bunch of complexity when you actually start building out these multi-container environments. And so with Rudder, it allows you to get back to just like normal. It allows you to actually just treat your containers like they're servers from a networking perspective. And that means all the orchestration and the service discovery. Kind of goes back to these back to the way that we're used to doing it between servers. So we don't have to change anything to use containers, I guess, is the core value.
Okay. Networking has really kind of like taken some different turns over the past 12 to 18 months. Michael, did you notice this at all? Are you starting to see some interesting shifts? It seems to me there are.
In networking? Sure. Well, I've got this book over here, and I thought I would read it. It would be like Interconnection Second Edition, and I thought that would like help me understand all this networking stuff because I'm just a lowly application developer. But I've never read it. I don't know that much about networking. But it does seem like the little bit of chatter that I've had with people, it seems like the same state that server automation used to be in. Not so long ago, where it was sort of like this weird art that programmers had no access to. And I think a lot of what you see in networking, whether it's software-defined networking and things like that, is a similar issue of the way that networks are administered and managed and secured are not really in a developer-friendly way. Hence, having a sysadmin and all of those guys. And then, as you add on developer-friendly APIs and other things to networking, it just gets treated like another piece of middleware, which opens up all sorts of fascinating options. The headline you often see is is the operating system dead, right? Because you have cloud and you just treat it as a chunk of middleware, and it's sort of overthrowing it, as it were. But I think there's a similar effects you see happening with networking. Like you start using networking not just as some magical thing that some dweeby person who read that giant book knows, but just as another component of your overall application, which seems subtle, but it's a huge shift in the way you would architect things. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on in networking that I'm pretty much completely ignorant about, as evidenced by the volume of my reply here.
One important thing to call out networking and containers specifically, one of the things that Docker and containers allow you to do really well is have a consistent environment to run your application in. Meaning every time you run your application, you get the same environment set up and it executes the same way every time. And that level of consistency is a lot of like why Docker is awesome, is because they make that really easy, doing all these tricks with the file system and other things to make that really easy. But on networking, it's a whole different story. Every time you bring up your application in a Docker container, you have a new networking environment, and it still requires the application to know where it's running. And so with the solution that we're proposing here with Rudder, it means with Docker you get the consistent execution environment. With Rudder you get a consistent networking environment. So your applications can make assumptions about the networking environment that simplify how you can deploy it. Does that make sense?
How does it simplify?
Yeah. Because you can make assumptions. If you know it's going to run the same way in your development environment as it runs in production, because you're presented with the same network that you have locally that you do out on Amazon, and it's the exact same thing, then it means there's less variables, I guess. It's just it's a consistent environment to run your application in, both execution, but now from a networking perspective as well.
Yeah, and speaking more broadly again, right? Like there's this continuous give and take between, I forget the exact name of the old paper, but between smart pipes and dumb pipes, right? And at the moment, like if in IT, networking is kind of a smart pipe. Like it requires a lot of thinking about it, and as Alex was pointing out, screwing around with it, and it's not consistent, and it's annoying. Whereas like what you really want is a dumb pipe, which is kind of like a file system is kind of like a dumb thing. Like it acts the same all the time. You don't have to worry about it. And I think getting to the point where you don't really have to worry about networking so much would be great. But again, it relies on the fact that you could actually program network stuff, and not have to do manual configuration and all sorts of other things you need certificates for. Like it has to become as boring as FAT32 essentially, which is not too thrilling to deal with.
So you were talking, Alex, about this idea of the flat network and that this helps create. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So, Rudder would enable you to have a flat network, for instance, between different cloud providers, or between your on-prem servers and your Amazon hosts. And so because we did overlay network at At the OS level, it means that we can actually present you a common network regardless of the actual networking environment that you're running on underneath. So that, again, that just means like you get a consistent view of the network, but it also enables some of these like hybrid type use cases as well, which typically are not possible because of the networking involved to do it. But this is a very simple overlay network that allows you to do that. So again, theoretically here, you could use Rudder to deploy a physical server, one on Amazon and one on Google, and they all can share a common network and address each other over a common network.
And so this then, that's with on top of, that's with CoreOS and using CoreOS, obviously.
Well, so the nice thing about CoreOS is bit for bit identical no matter where you run it. You're going to get the same CoreOS if you're running it in Vagrant on your laptop versus if you're running it on Amazon. Okay, and so you could set up now, put Rudder on top of CoreOS, and you have that consistency sort of all around. Now, could you run Rudder not on CoreOS? Definitely. At the end of the day, it's a Go program. It requires Linux because we talked through the Linux networking stack, and then it also requires etcd. And etcd you can use outside of CoreOS as well. So this is a good example of just how we build our products in that, yes, it's a component that you could use outside of CoreOS if you want to, but if you opt into the CoreOS way, we just make it all easy and consistent for you and just set it all up for you.
Okay. So again, what was the impetus for this? I'm curious about that. What you were thinking about when you were.
Right. We originally designed this because the Kubernetes networking model. So Kubernetes says like every application needs to be deployed with a routable IP address, and that's just not like technically possible. For instance, on AWS. So I guess to really distill it down, we wanted to run Kubernetes on AWS, and the networking doesn't allow you to actually do that. Like the networking protects you about that. So we had to build an overlay network to do it. Now this product will solve a bunch of other problems too around like flattening the network between the cloud providers and so on. But the primary motivation was around Kubernetes and being able to run it on platforms that don't support. It's funny, the actual degraded case of a simpler network, like let's just say you're using a physical network with a switch, like the thing you have at home in your closet, like that is actually works with Kubernetes no problem. It's these higher end networks like Amazon's that don't. And so we had to build this to work around the sophistication in Amazon or in Google networks in order to enable this in a generic way.
Yeah, they're overly smart. That's the issue, right?
Right.
Like your little box at home is just stupid.
And that's why they all work in different ways, though. They're all smart, but they all work in different ways. So the application is getting into a different bag depending on where it's running.
Right, that makes sense. Yeah. So you've got your own little overlay network you can toss around everywhere, and yeah. That's exciting. Then you can sort of like do some distributed architectures and be pretty ignorant about where things are located. It's like one day soon we'll finally reinvent J2EE.
Exactly. Except this time
we'll rewritten it from the core. We'll have good libraries and we'll have much cheesier names. So it'll be great.
Kubernetes.
Yep.
So Kubernetes has really created a lot of excitement, hasn't it, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I would say like Kubernetes is quickly becoming the Docker for cluster management. So it has the profile of Docker in terms of, like it's written in Go again. It kind of uses these common set of tools. It's container focused, but it's an independent component that you can go and run. And the Google guys that are working on it, this isn't their first rodeo. They've built this stuff before at massive scale, and they're doing it similar to like what Rackspace did with OpenStack. Remember when Rackspace announced Nova and OpenStack? Rackspace wasn't running it on their cloud.
Right.
They announced this project and started building sort of mindshare around it, and that's what Google's doing too. And I don't know where Google ends up with it on their own cloud, but I have to imagine it's similar to the move that Rackspace pulled with OpenStack. The difference here is just that I think we might actually get 100% portability on the Kubernetes stuff. OpenStack is great, but there's just a little bit different, and they can't be just a little bit different when you deploy it if you're a service provider or if you're an on-prem thing. So Kubernetes perhaps is going to be this where you can deploy against a cloud provider and it works the same as if you're deploying against your own on-prem thing, and it actually behaves the same way. So we'll see, but it's definitely getting some traction, and the software behind it is real as well.
So, Alex, can you explain for the folks who are listening to this show how CoreOS works with Kubernetes?
Sure. So I don't say this too often because, marketing, not sure if they really like it, but CoreOS is really the undercloud in a way. It's the thing you run underneath your cloud platform. And so Kubernetes is an example of a distributed application that needs to be deployed on Linux, on server somewhere. And CoreOS is a great platform, a great target to deploy that distributed application against. Another application you could deploy on CoreOS is like Mesos, or another one could be OpenStack. These are these applications that, by nature of what they are, require more than one server. And so CoreOS is a great target to deploy those things against. So Kubernetes, from our perspective, is an application that runs runs on top of CoreOS, and particularly across a distributed set of CoreOS machines. We find it very interesting because we think the world needs a good cluster manager, just one that works well, kind of like how the world needs a kernel that works well. And there's a couple options out there right now, but Kubernetes is definitely one to watch.
Donnie, you've been following the Kubernetes story, haven't you, pretty closely? And there was some interesting news from VMworld this week about it. Anything strike you of particular interest?
With Kubernetes, I mean, it's gone to the same kind of point where Docker was about a year ago, where people are, some people have real stuff to say about it, right? Like Alex here is doing some really interesting stuff and building rudder to sort of the never-end situation. But then there's a lot of people who just say, oh, well, we have to have a Docker story, right? And now it's like, it's sort of like we have to have a Kubernetes story, right? Like, it's become a big PR and marketing push beyond the value of the tech.
Donnie, your voice is totally broken. I don't know. I'm sorry.
I tried.
It sounds like you're broadcasting from Hoth, which is kind of quaint. Just don't shoot that robot. It's going to bring some stuff down on us.
And Alex Polby is dropping out right now. Alex, thank you for joining us. Alex Polby, CEO and co-founder of CoreOS, and look forward to talking to you soon.
All right. Thank you so much, Alex.
Okay. Well, Donnie, I'm not sure we'll see how this goes. But maybe Michael, you can talk about how, were you able to get any detailed look at Project Fargo at all?
No, not enough. I actually had that on my list of things to do. But yeah, it does seem like one of there's two things like at VMworld that sort of for new stackery type of people that were interesting, and that is the grafting on and acceptance of, well, acceptance is a strong word, doing stuff with Docker and other containerization and things that come with that. And then there was also the thing I was most interested about is trying to figure out what exactly their OpenStack thing is. and not so much what exactly it is, but figure out it's a good test for seeing what the broader market wants OpenStack to be. There's an OpenStack summit coming up in Paris in November or something, and there's sort of like always an existential crisis about OpenStack a few weeks before every summit. So I'm sure it'll come up. And it'll be interesting to see if VMware's approach gets traction or interest. It makes a pretty strong statement about what OpenStack is. Namely, as I was tweeting earlier in the week, that it's much more of a spec than an implementation. But what I mean by that is my understanding so far of what does VMware call it? It's like VOI or something, vOpenStack implementation or some snappy name like that. And essentially, if you look at the big burger, the layer cake that they have, there's like all the VMware stuff underneath as the undercloud, to use Alex's word, which is a nice word. That's a good category. I'm gonna have to steal. And then on top of it is this thin layer, this wafer thin layer, as it were, of OpenStack APIs. So essentially, this would differ from like downloading the raw open source code, the raw OpenStack code, and compiling it and having like a thing, like a bag of bits. Because instead of what it is they have API compatibility, if you will. And those APIs call down to their own implementation to do various things, to use the VMware undercloud, which, could be fine. Like that could be totally A-okay and no problem at all. And it'll be interesting to see if that is the acceptable way of doing things, because then it would suggest more of the, we talked with Martin Mikos a while back. It'll suggest more of the eucalyptus way of thinking about cloud, which is a cloud is really just compatibility with a set of APIs that allow you to do something, and the actual code and implementation is not really the important part of it, which I don't think that's really settled in the OpenStack world. So, it's a nice little experiment that VMware is running, right? Like, so in theory, if VMware wins here, there could be a lot of OpenStack clouds running that are essentially running on closed source VMware software. You see, like it would be like analogously, if I got Linux and it turns out that underneath Linux is Windows Server. And it was like duck typing, to steal a word from the mid 2000s, where like one of the interesting, if you have a non-statically typed language and you have this duck typing concept where if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it must be a duck. So even if there was, using my cheesy analogy, it was all Windows Server underneath it, if you could talk to it and deal with it like it was Linux, would that be Linux or would that be Windows? Who knows? And so there's a similar kind of possibility in the OpenStack world, which would be exciting.
So you think this VMware news kind of puts it could be a potential example of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, if you look at what they have API compatibility on top, right? And they would probably, school me on this is the wrong way of phrasing it, but there's the API layer on top so you can interact with stuff, the ins and the outs, as if it was OpenStack, and then underneath it kind of goes down into actual VMware implementation of things. And every OpenStack distro does this, right? Like, well, I don't know if that's true, but many OpenStack distros are like that. They'll like take out the file system and put in their own file system, or take out the scheduler and put in their own scheduler. But it's not like Linux where you can kind of just swap stuff in and out on your own. Like OpenStack is a lot more liberal with that. And it brings up this question is what OpenStack becomes just a set of APIs that you're compatible with, or is it something more fundamental than that? Which is, that's probably number 3 or 4 on the existential crisis thing OpenStack goes through every quarter or so. So there's new grist for that mill.
What? Yeah, I'm trying to understand what would be the reasons for it being more fundamental.
It being more like why? So why is this a concern or something that's?
Why would it be more? Why not just a set of APIs?
Oh, right. Well, because why wouldn't you just have a set of APIs? Because in theory, if you were to pull down all of the OpenStack source code, there's actual code that you can compile that does everything you need. So in any sort of open source project, you would have a spec or the APIs, right? And then you have a bunch of people who are working on the implementation for that API, right? Like the actual code that does the work. And in an open source community, there's often the idea of like, why do we have 5 different implementations? Why don't we just have everyone collaborate on the one implementation that does it really well, right? Like we don't need 5 ways of scheduling where jobs are in a cloud. Why don't we just all of us make, Nova and the various other parts work really well? Why don't make a closed source version that then you sell for a lot and you're just kind of like a free rider on this community? Instead, you should contribute that, open source that code, if you will. And this don't fork it and don't have your closed source version is a very like, GPL way of, very Linux way of thinking about things, right? Like the point of it is that if you write a better implementation for this spec, what you owe the community is open sourcing that code because they've done so much for you, right? Versus we have a specification and you're free to write your own version of it and you owe us nothing, right? You can keep that code to yourself and profit off of it by charging a high premium because your implementation works better than the community's implementation. And, this is one of those philosophic things of like, where you fall, which one of those is good, bad, or if you're more like myself, you don't really care. It kind of defines your stance on open source and the IT and how software works in the IT industry and things like that nowadays.
Why don't you really care?
Why don't I personally really care? Mostly because I don't really have a dog in the fight on either side. Like I just like churn and chaos. It's just like yourself, right? If you're on the sideline and you're a commentator on the IT industry, the more chaos there is, the more business there is for people like us, right? Like if every problem was solved and it was kind of boring, like we would be writing about. Well, it's hard to think of an industry that hasn't changed in a long time because you got all these computers nowadays. But you need new things coming along and conflicts and stories. Otherwise, it's a really boring trade press. Like, I bet the packing industry is not too exciting compared to the tech industry to write about.
Yeah.
They've got those Tetra Packs. Those are kind of cool. And someone invented those things you get in Amazon that aren't styrofoam peanuts. As far as I can tell, those are major innovations that have happened.
We could debate about that stuff endlessly.
That's right. But anyways, so it's good to have lots of churn and conflict, and also being less snarky about it. In theory, if there are many different models of production and things like that, it means you're coming up with new things. Like that's why things like however you say the Kubernetes and now the rudder stuff and CoreOS and Mesosphere, all those guys are coming up with new different ways to do sort of the same thing, and it's exciting. Like, one of them's bound to work, so it's good to have lots of different ways of trying it.
It totally is. So what did you think of the VMware news overall? And then we'll talk about Project Fargo a little bit. There's not a lot about it.
Yeah, I think overall, I went through my typical cycle of conference stuff where I'd woken up very early, so I was really crabby the first day, figuring out why I was there. And then I got a good night's rest and I was much happier, and I kind of actually paid attention and realized what was happening. I mean, I think VMware is like a huge enough company that they're having to clean up their portfolio and consolidate a lot of things, right? So they did a lot of renaming of things and moving from giant ponderous portfolios, at least in slides, to more simplified ways of doing things. And they also have, the other interesting thing to pay attention to is that they have, I don't know how broadly you would say it was, but there's a broad intention to have SaaS versions of their software, right? So rather than just being, as they would call it in internal VMware talk, transactional applications, or just licensed software on a perpetual license that you quickly buy and install, they're also looking at SaaS things that they need to do increasingly, which is great. And then there's all the OpenStack stuff we were talking about and kind of embracing Docker. So they're very much so, they have roadmaps, actual products, I think in market, if not in beta, and then also lots of strategy around the idea of we just want to be the infrastructure that runs whatever you want to do, right? Which is obviously what they want to do, right? Like an alternative could have been like, yeah, all that OpenStack and container stuff is crap. You just need to run VMware, right? Like that could be a stance that they could have. That would be the straw man Microsoft position that Microsoft even doesn't have nowadays, right? Like, just run it on the Windows stack. You don't need all this other nonsense. I mean, Microsoft doesn't really even do that so much nowadays, but it's good that VMware has solidly moved into that position of our job is to run whatever infrastructure you may have, and of course we would prefer it if you ran our infrastructure, but we're going to make sure our management software is heterogeneous and works with things. We're going to make sure we can manage whatever type of popular cloud you have, and also our stuff is cool too. So it's just sort of opening up to heterogeneity instead of just homogeny, if you will.
Why would they do this?
Well, because someone not Microsoft, see, exactly. Someone in a Microsoft or a VMware position, their main job is not stumbling. I mean, I could use coarser language to describe it, but they need to retain the customers they have and, grow their customer base a little bit. And if there are many options in the market, as we were just discussing in the first half of the show, what you end up doing is you just become compatible and interoperable with those other options. So your first message is like, hey, customers, don't leave. If you want that, we got it, right? Like, you can experiment with containers and OpenStack and do whatever you want and still pay us and be VMware people. The alternative is, again, to use a straw man, is to say, in some straw man that pseudo existed in the early 2000s, like, hey, you've heard about this Linux thing. You don't need that junk. Use Windows Server, right? And instead, you would say, yeah, you can do Linux stuff. It can run on Windows still, right? And you can still use all of our stuff, and that's just a thing that you can run in our stratosphere of things. So it gives you the ability to retain the huge leadership position that you have in customers, and also allows you to address new markets to some extent as they evolve.
So, are you bullish on?
And I suppose there's a genuine thing of providing new functionality to customers. That's always nice too.
It seems to me that they can, it doesn't hurt them in any way to open up in this kind of manner, where to be, for VMware virtualization and containers. It seems
right, and indeed, there's so when there's a lesson, there's a few lessons from the late '80s that most vendors internalize in their strategies, whether they realize it or not. I mean, the first one is the famous Osborne effect. Like, don't announce that you're going to have a much better, cheaper computer in 6 months because it'll tank your current sales. So try not to pre-announce things. And then the other one is don't be IBM to Microsoft when it comes to embracing open, as Steve Jobs used to call it, open systems, which is much different than open source, right? Yeah. So the error that IBM did for overly historical context is they took what was essentially an open platform, Windows, and gave Microsoft sort of carte blanche license without an exclusive, if I remember correctly, without an exclusive partnership to run the operating system on PCs. So then that allowed clones to also take DOS and run it on them, which established a standard, namely DOS, which evolved into Windows. So suddenly, because of IBM's, there probably was no way around it, but because of what retroactively was a huge blunder, Microsoft IBM made Microsoft by making them into the de facto standard. So if you're a vendor like VMware or anyone nowadays, that's the one major thing you're trying to avoid when you embrace new things. And that's usually when you see criticism from the open cloud about moves like this, they're trying to ferret out where that's happening. So inevitably what you'll see is commentary whenever a closed source vendor embraces an open source thing. The first round of attacks is around patents, right? So what patents does this company have or not grant use for that they could then ding you for if you use this overall platform? And that was a big to-do back when Java was open sourcing and all sorts of stuff. It was in the 2000s, patents were a good way of dinging people for embracing open platforms because that's a way you can protect your asset as a closed vendor. And then the second thing is figuring out, well, how open is this stuff, right? And that's why being an API for OpenStack is so interesting versus being an implementation, right? So a criticism that one could have would be, well, so your APIs are compatible, who cares, right? Like your actual implementation is closed source, and that's where you're going to lock people in and do all of this nonsense. So there are ways that closed source hurts their assets and their ability to make money. And that's why I'm so interested in that, because it'll be good to see the reaction to that move and see if the market cares or not, right? Analogously, you can look at, I was making jokes about J2EE earlier, right? So Java was always a specification with open implementations of it and closed implementations of it. And there's all sorts of hijinks about how open communities versus closed source vendors dealt with that and profited from it and pissed each other off.
And the customer, do they care? I mean, the customers that you talk to?
I don't think so, and I think that's the big shift that you see in cloud versus open source middleware. The last frame of reference that we had for open source was in middleware, right? And developers tend to care a great deal about genuine open sourceness, but even nowadays they care, but also they kind of don't care as much as they used to, at least. And and then I think when you go to the operations side of the house, the IT admin side of the house, based on what they spend money on, I don't think they care at all. Operations people, they want code that works and that's affordable. And if it's free, that's awesome. But essentially, if it works and satisfies their needs, that's what they're more focused on.
Mm-hmm. So the other announcement that they had was about this Project Fargo, and I don't know enough about it to really talk about it eloquently, but I was hoping you would.
Yes. Well, like a good analyst, it takes me a long time before I actually know something.
But maybe we should just talk about basically what it is.
Sure.
And so I'm reading. I just pulled up a post by Simon Sharwood of the Register, um, and he described it as it allows a live VM to be copied, spawned, and booted in what VMware today claimed will be seconds. And actually, Adrian Cockcroft, I was talking to him last night about it, and he echoed the same thing. And he said, if that sounds, Simon writes, if that sounds improbable, VMware silences the doubters by saying that a new VM uses the very same memory and storage as the first, a weird kind of meta virtualization. What do you take of that?
Oh, well, if it's associated to the cloud volume, right. So, I mean, there's a bit of container magic going on there, right? Like, in the sense of, anyways, like usually when someone talks about meta virtualization, I don't know why the register's always spelling things wrong. Why do they have an S in there? Do you know why? It's very troubling. They need to get some better copy editors. So you can use it.
I think it's a British thing.
I know. I'm being fatuous, as they say. Anyhow, yeah.
I'm being slow.
Especially in the like in the desktop virtualization area, right? There's all sorts of shims and tricks that you do to bring things up more quickly. But yeah, I don't know enough about what Fargo is to really speak to it. But yeah, it is. I mean, essentially, VMware does have to, just like Red Hat has to have like a container answer, right?
Yeah,
like they need to start. They need to start having an answer to containers, and in pretty much all of the executive talks, there was obviously some internal messaging memo that went around that said, whenever you mention containers, you need to make sure to say containers are not a new technology. It's sort of like, you remember back in like 2009. There was a memo sent to all the incumbent vendors, and they had to talk about how cloud was not a new technology, and it kind of had existed in mainframes. Like, I think there was a similar memo circulated around VMware about containers. So the benefits you have are like speed, right, and things coming up and down really quickly. And obviously, that's something that someone like VMware has to have an offering for. And I'm glad someone else picked up on the chipper shredder thing. That's nice.
Yeah. I heard a lot of people. I heard some people talking about chipper shredders too, and I asked Donnie about. I said, Donnie, you're from Minnesota. Like, aren't you excited that there's a project? It's called Project Fargo. He's like, it's an awful name. I'm like, why? He's like, it's like the movie. There was another one they had, Evo.
Oh yeah, on Rail or whatever, and then there's the dynamic one.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, from my interaction, I didn't spend a lot of time looking at that because I was more paying attention to the management stacks and announcements. But yeah, it's sort of like, I think they very specifically don't want to call it a reference architecture, but it's sort of like a certified architecture for making appliances, just appliances like mini converged infrastructure boxes, if you will. Which sounds fine. I mean, people always want like the simple appliance for running all of your gear. So that's nice.
I heard people almost sounded like they were talking about something evil.
Yeah. Yeah.
It sounded like you were saying evil rail.
Yeah, the naming is always a little odd. Like I of course, being like an aged person myself, thought about Ruby on Rails first and couldn't get that out of my head. But I think the notion was more that you can insert it into one rail, right? Like in a rack was more of what the intention was.
I kept thinking of the third rail on the subway line. You don't want to touch that third rail.
Ah, yes. Well, now we've got thorough homework for ourselves. We need to look up Fargo better, and also Evo Rail and the other Evos, so we can correct the errors that we've made for ourselves.
We'll need to get someone on from VMware. I want to do that. Yeah. Well, it was a fun event. It was more interesting to me than I thought it would be, especially kind of with the Docker container stuff. I guess I wasn't surprised, but I just was as kind of refreshed that it came up as a topic. It just seems to kind of made the event a little bit more palatable. And then and I think there were some interesting kind of There's some interesting corollary discussions about networking that come out that I found were interesting related to the work that Martine is doing with NSX and how that's been evolving and how that could fit with this new strategy. And that's where it's interesting, where it seems like VMware can offer, they can just keep adding things like containers, because Open vSwitch allows for it to just connect. The complexity comes when just kind of being understanding that network a little bit better. And he said that's kind of an area where they'll be focusing is on richer programming languages to to better able to connect lots of different things, but not just connect them, but be able to understand the relationship.
Oh, yes. Well, since you're in the heavy bit offices, are you hanging out with any wacky developer types in there?
Oh, I think they were watching that startup show on HBO.
Nice.
During lunch, I think that's maybe what they do. They watch episodes of the startup show. Whatever it's called. Yeah, they are wacky here. They're wacky. We're actually, Michael, are you going to possibly be in San Francisco on October 1st?
October 1st?
Yes.
Well, let's go to the scheduling part of our program here.
Okay.
Always a favorite part where I check my calendar and see. No, looks like I will be in Austin for October 1st.
Darn. We're having our first meetup.
Yeah?
The new
Now,
staff.
is that MEAT or MEET?
Well, I wanted to call it a warm-up. The warm-up to the meetup, to the MEAT up. I guess you could call it that. Yeah. But a meetup would be great. Like, pork and podcasting, meet up and meet people.
Pork, podcasting, and people. Three things that are great together.
And we'll have a giant buffet.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so you're gonna have the new Stack meetup. That sounds exciting. You know what you should call? I'm not a branding expert. But here's a free one. The meetup. Basically, you put the in front of everything, like the hotel.
I like it.
Yeah. That's a free one.
So when are you back here, though? When are you back in San Francisco? Are you here for IDF or no?
No, I don't have any San Francisco plans at the moment.
Okay.
I'll be going to our 451's Hosting and Cloud Technology or Transformation Summit in towards the end of is it the end of October? I just booked this travel and I can't even remember when it is.
To London?
No, it's in Las Vegas, of course.
Oh.
You gotta be there, and it's when is it in October? October 6th, if I remember. Yeah, it's October 6th and 7th and 8th. And I've got a panel there on developer relations and marketing, which would be fun. I wrote a long report on that, but that's the next travel thing that I have, and then I'll be in Chicago for a little speaking engagement, and that's all I got.
Oh, you go to Paris?
Yeah, of course.
Excellent. All right, well, we'll be there. We're having a meetup there, too. We're having a meetup.
Okay, well, I could go to the Love Meetup. That would be great. I can go to that one.
In Paris, we'll call it Love Meetup.
Perfect.
In America, it's the meetup. What is the Spanish for the?
The Spanish? It would be like el or la. Like el hombre is the man, and la mujer is the woman.
So what would it be? El meetup?
If you were in Spain. I don't know if meetup is feminine or masculine, but sure, el meetup.
Well, maybe we'll have one in like in Southwest Texas or something.
Well, they're having a VMworld Barcelona, so you could go there and have your el meetup.
El meetup, yeah. We'll have to have them, different parts of the world, different meetups.
That's right.
Well, Michael, it's been good to talk with you today. Sorry we didn't get a chance to hang out that much at VMworld, but I sense you were running around quite a bit.
Yeah, you got to watch out with your calendar. You got to not let people schedule things.
That's right.
Competency.
All right. Well, listen. Thanks for joining us again. We'll be back again next week for the new Stack Analysts. Hopefully, Donnie will have better audio then. And Michael, thanks for joining us. We'll need to get someone on from VMware to talk about.
Maybe next time I'll actually know something.
Maybe,
And I can be more
maybe we'll all
concise.
be a little bit more enlightened.
That's
All
right.
right.
Well, enjoy the pork.
Thank you. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
So long.